You present a theory of the mind, which is very useful for making sense of human behavior and self-control, as well as generally how the mind works. Tell me about self-control.
At the time that I started doing this work, the resource view was the mainstream. People have this resource in their head, and as you do something effortful, it gets used up. And that struck me as wildly unlikely. The idea that there was some mysterious substance in your head that gets used up.
Would you be willing to say that this theory is just false?
Yes.
What can we do using this knowledge of modules to be more effectively self-disciplined?
There are various techniques, so you want to...
Dr. Robert Kurzban is an evolutionary psychologist and a former professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Kurzban was mentored and trained by Dr. John Tooby and Dr. Leda Cosmides, both founders of and pioneers in the field of evolutionary psychology. Dr. Robert Kurzban, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to talk to you today because you present a theory of the mind, an evolutionary theory of the mind, which is very useful for making sense of human behavior and how we think and that sort of thing. It resolves a lot of the apparent contradictions of the mind, and it sheds light on many subjects like self-control and morality and hypocrisy and self-esteem and self-deception, among many other things, as well as generally how the mind works. But before we get into that, why do you think the theory of evolution should or does tell us much about the mind? How is that useful for understanding the human mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess where I would start is, if there's any theory that has proven productive in explanation, and that maybe in the entire history of the human endeavor, it's the Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. It's been a theory that has been able to explain behavior and structures across the entire biological world. It has this incredible record of success, and wherever people have tried to falsify it, it has been resistant to falsification. It's arguably some people have called it the single most powerful idea in the natural sciences. So in that context, it would be bizarre if there were like one exception to it, the one that, happens to be in the heads of the people who were just doing the work. And not only that, but the thing about evolution by natural selection is that what it explains is functional complexity, things that do something useful and are complicated. And if there's anything more complicated than the human mind, we haven't discovered it yet. So in some ways, the human mind is the quintessential place where you would look for the end products of evolution by natural selection. It would be very strange if the mind were an exception to that. But not only that, it's already been useful. I mean, people don't think about it, but the visual system is part of the human mind, right? It starts at the retina, goes into the back of your head, whatever. And that, it's got to be that evolution was the cause of that functional complexity, the reason that we could see objects and recognize faces and so on. So for me, there's really very little doubt left, if any, to the extent that a theory has been vindicated by now over 100 years of attempts to falsify it. I think it's a theory of evolution by natural selection. So that's the sort of the shorthand version of why I think it's useful.
Reams and reams and reams of evidence. That is what brought me to evolution in the first place. I remember that there was a day back in my early youth, my pre-scientific youth, where I was skeptical of it because I thought, how in the world does a bacteria turn into a human? But upon reviewing a lot of the work that many, many, many scientists have done, yeah, it seems like the evidence all points in the direction of evolution. And anytime it doesn't, it seems that it's an error in the evidence gathering method, because when attempts are made to replicate it, the evidence just seems to point in one direction.
It's hard to come up with a theory that has, and because people don't, I didn't like the theory and still don't in some sense, there's the attempts to try to falsify it have been legion. So if you want to evaluate a theory by how well it's resisted attempts of falsification, obviously, theories in physics have similarly withstood falsification. So I don't want to take anything away from the other natural sciences, but people are much more animated about trying to get rid of evolution than they were about, the laws of thermodynamics, which have no sort of social weight.
Yeah, nobody really cares about thermal equilibrium and that kind of thing, except for physicists, I suppose. There aren't ideological motives to avoid it. And you and your colleagues, including your advisors, Dr. John Tooby, Dr. Leda Cosmides, pioneers, if founders of the field of modern evolutionary psychology, you guys have done great, because now I'll read what I deem to be, in my youth, historical records of people like E.O. Wilson or others of that ilk being vilified for suggesting that evolution should be applied to humankind. And to me, it just seems so obvious. When I heard the things like that, I thought, wait, you're telling me that so long after the theory of evolution, people still rejected it being used on humans? So I guess the zeitgeist really has changed on that front.
Yes and no. I guess what I would say is there's still a significant fraction of both the academic world and certainly the political world that resists the idea that evolution is relevant to understanding the human mind. I mean, it has by no means become universal, either in, again, the academy or in mainstream views. There's this great image, I think, of John Haidt, who's talking about science denialism on both sides of the aisle, left and right. And, on the right, you have, whatever, maybe some climate stuff and so on. But on the left, you have this stuff. The idea that evolution is relevant to human social behavior. And again, I'm not trying to take a political position here. I'm just trying to say, when I started with John Tooby and Leda Cosmides back in 1993, a million years ago, I remember I had this conversation with them, and I said, look, I'm a little worried about, my career, because these ideas are so powerful, and they're going to be adopted, obviously, by scholars in the next 10 years because of their power in explaining human behavior. There's not going to be much left to do. John Tooby, now unfortunately the late John Tooby, he laughed a guttural laugh. God bless his soul. And he's turned out to be right. Like, he said, yeah, this doesn't work like that, and you're going to find out it doesn't work like that, and it will be an uphill climb for, a couple generations. And here we are 2 generations later, at least one. And he was essentially right about that. When I did a sabbatical back in 2008 at Chapman University in California, I read about the history of science. And one of the things that I learned during my reading was every change in science takes 50 years. It's just a very slow process. Scientists are slow to adopt ideas, even if they're good ones. And there's a limitless number of examples of that.
I'm hoping that with the passage of time, once aspiring scientists see the same process happening over and over and over and over, maybe we will learn from our mistakes, although humanity is notoriously bad at doing that. I don't know if you're familiar with unfortunately, I'm having a severe case of source amnesia. There was a study about so they asked a group of parents to report how much grief how much grief they expect to feel if their child were to die. And the children were, of course, plotted for their age. And they asked these parents to guess how much grief they would feel. And the curve of assumed grief correlated, I think it was a 0.9 correlation with the fitness advantage of having a child at that age, or the reproductive advantage. I forget the exact results, unfortunately, as well as the author, so I'll have to check that later. But a 0.9 correlation in psychology is, for anybody who doesn't know, that's a very high correlation. Are you familiar with that study?
I recently wrote a little bit about this, so I don't know that particular one you have in mind, but in general, there's some data that move in the direction that you're referring to. So one way to think about the grief system is it very well might be designed to measure the magnitude of a particular fitness loss, whether that's in the form of a partner, a child, a parent, and so on. So you'd expect that the magnitude that people experience would be related to the blow that their fitness has just taken. So for someone like me, I don't find that surprising. As you say, what I would find any correlation that big is, surprising in the social sciences. We get a 0.5 and we're jumping for joy. So being able to account for 80% of the variation in grief, that really is impressive. But I think that again points to, people wonder about the value of the approach. And certainly there's a really interesting case where the theory points you in a direction of a question to ask, right? So it says, if you think grief is for this, then if you measure that, you should see some relationship. And I think that's a really nice example where the theory points you in the direction to look.
And the thing about a theory, any theory really, in this case, the theory of evolution, is that when you make a theory about reality, you're attempting to model what you expect reality to be like. And the thing is, you would then say, if the theory of evolution is true, then we should expect this. And that specific study, the grief study, you would never think to even do a study like that unless you were coming from a place of predicting something at least akin to the theory of evolution. Because why would you want to plot the correlation between parental grief? And this is expected parental grief. This isn't, the kids didn't actually die. It's how much they would expect. But this really is the important variable, because people's behavior would be changed by how much grief they expect to have, how much aversion they have to their children dying. That's really what shapes the behavior. Because at the end of the day, once the kid dies, it's a sunk cost, unfortunately.
Right, which is one of the mysteries of some of these emotions that are backward looking. So some people have wondered, why bother having grief? And in fact, if you look at the non-human animal world, there's certain cases where it doesn't look like the organisms experience grief. I mean, you can't really tell, right? You can't ask the animal how sad it is. But in many cases, organisms die. I don't know. One of my favorite examples, it's kind of a weird one in this context, is the burying beetle. So the burying beetle lays a lot of eggs in, a rodent, and then the little babies hatch, and then they eat the rodent from the inside. And some of them are smaller and some of them are bigger. And the mom, burying beetle, she actually kills and eats the little ones to regurgitate to the big ones. So she's committing infanticide in order to help some of the other babies. So, the thing about fitness is it doesn't care about how you feel. What it cares about, how does it maximize reproductive success? And in the case of those burying beetles, it maximizes reproductive success by not motivating the female to feel grief and sort of give up after, but it motivates her to eat them, So, that's why it's important to kind of keep track of the fact that what evolution cares about is not the feeling, but what you do with it. And as you say, to the extent you predict feeling really bad for X, Y, or Z, that's going to cause you to work really hard to avoid X, Y, or Z.
And the feeling itself is shaped for the specific function. Just
exactly.
Statistically, any individuals within a species that happen to have at least a slight advantage will, over time, just with reproduction, just with advantages in reproduction, they'll take over the population, the trait, after enough generations, depending on the size of the advantage.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that's tricky about the evolution by natural selection is that our imaginations aren't very good at thinking about tiny little changes over large periods of time. And this is one of the reasons that, you talked about at the top of the show, how does it go from a one cell to whatever? It's like, if you have, humans are just bad at thinking about, hundreds of years, let alone millions of years. And so, very tiny changes, if you have enough generations, are going to shape adaptations over the species history. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, and what you referenced was former me thinking, before I knew anything about biology or almost anything, how could it possibly be the case that a single cell becomes a human? Bacteria to Bach? That doesn't make any sense. But yeah, I suppose that once you take into account very, very gradual changes in DNA and how DNA codes for proteins and how proteins end up building organisms, and how species, the lines between species really are just, can they reproduce with each other? I guess it's the common definition of a species, but there's not some kind of hard, it's not like each species has its own essence, as was thought for who knows how long.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people found it difficult to think about these changes over time. And of course, that was helped by, discoveries in anthropology and biology where, there was evidence of, skeletons of organisms which no longer existed, which helped people understand, so it's not that the world is static, it's that it's dynamic. And that, of course, is what you'd expect from the standpoint of evolution by natural selection.
And of course, if you posit that evolution is what shapes animals, organisms in general, then the evident yet very resisted conclusion is that it shapes us and that it shapes our minds.
Exactly. And of course, there was resistance to that. There still is resistance to that. But the thing about the theory of evolution by natural selection is that it's the only explanation that we have for any part of the world, the universe, that's organized in a way that's useful for itself. And so whenever you find something that is complex and it's useful, that the process of evolution by natural selection or artificial selection, but some kind of selection process has to be in part of the causal explanation. It's not an optional part of the full explanation of how the thing got that way.
The evidence all points in one direction, and so far we have nothing as a viable alternative that explains life and how it's developed even half as well. So I want to get into the meat and potatoes of your ideas about the mind. I'm going to spoil the ending here. Your idea is that there isn't some kind of monolithic self. There isn't just you and yourself within your psychology is one thing, and that rather our minds are somewhat cobbled together as sub-selves, modules. So tell me about your ideas about the modular mind.
I'm happy to. Like many academics, I sort of want to start out by just saying it wasn't my idea. That is to say, I have written my own thing, but people like Marvin Minsky and Jerry Fodor and Steve Pinker and others, just to name a few, have really, I think they get the credit for much of this. And as you said, my former advisors, John Tooby and Leda Cosmides. So I just want to start out by saying, shoulders of giants and all that. But yeah, so everywhere you look in the biological world, things that you find, structures, have specialized functions. And things that are big consist of smaller things that have functionally specialized parts. So even down to the insects. So you've got an insect, it's got some cells which are really good for seeing. You've got some cells which are good for flying. You've got some cells which maybe are good for walking around. And then in any normal organism, you're going to have some cells that are good for respiration, some organs that are good for digestion, and so on. And my claim, and other people's claim, is just that's the way the mind works. And if Steve Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, is sort of a lengthy exegesis of this point, which is to say, you've got a visual system, you've got an auditory system, you've got memory systems, you've got all these different things that work together. And what I want to say is that because, in Marvin Minsky's words, our brains are sort of a society of mind, it undermines the notion that there's something in there that's you. I would say there's, the whole thing is sort of you, but there's not like some kind of central, thing in there, like a little homunculus that's running the show. The show just is the output of all of those different specialized systems, the ones that feel emotions and the ones that get hungry and the ones that remember stuff and the ones that cause you to talk and move around. It's sort of a weird way to think about it because each of us feels sort of unitary, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's true. There's lots of things that we see in the world which, we're wrong about, optical illusions, and we have false beliefs. And my view is that you have all those modular systems working together, you get a person, but that doesn't mean that any one of them is more me or less me than any one of the other ones.
This somewhat makes sense, given the specialization of various things in biology, because specialization of function seems to be the rule as opposed to the exception. For example, cells, as you said, different cells have different functions, and you can go all the way up to the macro organism, I suppose, of a hive. You look at a hive of insects, for example. Even the insects there have specialized functions. You have the queen for reproducing, you have the workers, etc., soldiers, and so it does make sense that the mind would have specific subsystems that are specialized for important things within the human condition, things important for reproductive purposes, for social purposes, for survival purposes. So how would you explain the quotidian perspective of being a unitary self? Why is it that we do feel like just one thing? Why is that kind of woven to the tapestry of subselves? Why is that woven into one? I don't really want to go to consciousness because no one really has answers there. But you say, so we have this experience of everything being molded into one thing, yet you say it's separate. You talk about information encapsulation. So how do you make sense of the conflict between your mind being made of subselves versus the apparent unitary experience of it?
Yeah, well, you said yourself you don't want to get into consciousness, but it's hard to talk about this without moving in that direction. So what I would say is the one distinction which I do credit, which seems to be true, is that some stuff in your head seems to be conscious and some isn't. So for example, again, I like the visual system. We know for sure that your visual system is doing stuff like it's detecting edges, and then it's detecting faces, and it's detecting textures. And whatever you are, there's no conscious experience of that. You can't talk about what it's like to see to perform an edge detection calculation. What you do know is you can see the world, and you can talk about what it's like to see the world. And so I think what we could say is, look, some of these modular systems are conscious. and some of them are not. And we don't really know what consciousness is for, which means it's hard to say much about them. But I guess what I would say is, what's the alternative? Like, what would it be like if you didn't feel unitary? I mean, one thing that blows my mind is that it seems plausible to me that, let's say you take this idea seriously, that you've got all these modules in your head and they're all doing different stuff. And the ones that talk in my head are now talking to you, the ones in your head. But we have these other modules in our heads that are not connected up. They do something, but they're not connected up to, the sort of the conscious part. But what if they also had experience? What if they also had that it was like something to be them? You wouldn't know, because you're just you. Like, those modules are here, these guys are over here. So in some sense, I don't think there's any alternative besides kind of feeling unitary, because whichever ones are all melded together, they're all sort of bundled together. I know this sounds like a college dorm room conversation at 3 a.m., which is like, dude, what if some other part of your brain is conscious, but you don't know about it? But, like, that's true. Like, you wouldn't necessarily know if there were some other conscious bits of your brain. I mean, I like these studies that illustrate this. For example, Mike Zaniga did the split brain studies, right? So these are really important. You split someone's corpus callosum.
Classic studies.
And what we know from that is, there's stuff going on in one hemisphere. You artificially disconnect it that the other hemisphere just doesn't know about. I encourage your viewers just to Google Gazzaniga and split brain studies, and you'll see the basic idea. But the point is, those kinds of artificial modularization, where you separate the two things, they show what it's like for one set of systems not to know what the other system is up to. The right brain doesn't know what the left brain is up to until the right brain, or the left brain, let's say, moves the arm. And then this hemisphere can say, oh, for some reason my arm is moving. It doesn't know why your arm is moving. It doesn't know, because it doesn't have access. So that's a case where you've got two sort of conscious entities in the same skull that have been artificially modularized. We don't know that we're not like that, only with natural modularization instead of artificial, modularity. I mean, to me, that's scary, right? There could be all these conscious experiencing modules in people's heads or animals' heads, for all we know, that we can't talk to because we can't talk to them. They don't have control over the vocal system. They don't have control over the muscle systems. They're just sort of quiescent in there somewhere.
And so I'm sure that a decent chunk of people are thinking, what? And they're also thinking, why should I listen to this guy? But before we go there, quick recap of the Gazzaniga studies. If I were to take my brain out of my head and put it right here, it kind of look like a walnut. The middle part is called the corpus callosum, connects the two hemispheres. If you cut that part, now these two hemispheres can't really communicate anymore. And the left hemisphere is responsible for speech. And the thing is, now you can talk. It's a little bit weird because the ears cross connect. So the left ear connects to the right hemisphere, right ear connects to the left hemisphere. Odd. I don't think anybody knows why this is the case, but you can talk to one ear, communicate with the other hemisphere, and have it do things. So if you communicate through the left ear to the right hemisphere and have the right hemisphere do something, and then you ask the person, why did you do that? The hemisphere that responds is the left one, because that's the one responsible for generating speech. The problem is the left hemisphere has no idea why it's doing what it's doing, because the right hemisphere did it. And then you end up with people who confabulate, which is basically just making up explanations. They'll tell the right hemisphere, stand up. So the person will stand up. And then they ask them, why did you stand up? And they'll make something up like, oh, I wanted to go get a Coke. And so I suppose that would be, yes, a very clear instance of modularizing. You're splitting the hemispheres. So just to make this really explicit before we move further, what is a module?
People have argued about how to define it. So I think of it relatively simply as a specialized computational device. So I should also say that my former lab mate, David Petrzewski, and I think Annie Wirtz have written a paper a couple of years ago where they say, we should get rid of the word modular. So, this is, in some sense, there's now debate about how you want to talk about it. But I think the key pieces are that and also Jerry Fodor has a nice book in 1975 about modularity. Your viewers can take a look. But I just mean something that is specialized. And in this context, it computes. So it's some kind of system in your head that has some kind of function that we can specify. Not necessarily going to be correct about it, but we can say it is. And it has at least some degree of specialization, and it is at least to some degree discrete. So, and that's why I think, David and others have said, well, if you just mean that you've got a specialized information processing device in your head, you should just say that, which is fine. But the point simply is, for people who have been doing programming, you can think of it as like a little tiny subroutine that has, a very specific function. And an important part of that is, just like in programming, that means that they can be hierarchical. That means they can be integrated. Two different systems can call on one function. One big modular system can have lots of subcomponents. The pieces inside of that, maybe they can be called from other modules. The piece of it that's important from an evolutionary point of view is function, because the key piece of evolution is that what matters is the function, how the thing executes whatever its contribution is to the adaptive problem. So specialized function is the main piece. Some people have added additional elements. So some people have talked about the fact that if you've got a specialized computational device, only certain kinds of inputs will be processed by that device. It can only have a narrow set of outputs. I view these things all as empirical claims. That is, any given module is going to have some inputs, some outputs. But the key piece is going to be, what is it for? What does it do? And how does it do it?
I think that a way I have of conceptualizing this, I find that analogy is a great way to think about abstract things like this. You could just look at the human body, for example. If you look at the pancreas, say, it's secreting insulin to keep your glucose under control. Your heart isn't doing that. Your heart is pumping blood. These are different, you could say, modules of the tissues in your body that are serving different functions. And you'll notice that some of them are connected. For example, your lungs to your heart to oxygenate your body. Those are connected. But then you would expect that other ones, such as maybe the joint in your elbow, isn't connected to your appendix. Maybe it is, for all I know. But you would expect that the connections between these physical modules in your body would be functional. They'd be connected to each other for a reason. We would evolve to have lungs connected to our hearts because that's an efficient way of sending oxygen to all the tissues. Whereas we don't really have a great reason for our right toe to be connected to our bladder because it doesn't really do anything for us. So would you say that the idea of modules in the mind is something like that? There's some kind of psychological organ that are sometimes connected for functional purposes or sometimes disconnected, either because there's no functional reason for them to be connected or there's a functional reason for them to be disconnected. And one thing before you answer is, I'm not suggesting that these are phrenology style modules within the brain, although there's some of that, like the visual cortex, which is basically for vision. Would you say that that's a good analogy for your idea of the modular mind?
I would say that's a good analogy. In fact, people have talked about mental organs using this way of speaking. So the initial notion of modularity was that people talked about mental organs. And I just want to highlight a piece of what you just said that's really important, which is the hierarchical nature. So it's true that you can talk about the function of, let's say, a kidney in terms of filtering. But then even within the kidney, as you know, there's specialized cells that have different ways in which they contribute to that particular function. So the specialization goes all the way down, right? It's from the cellular system to the tissue system to the organ system. So it's perfectly coherent. And that's, I think that's really nice because, when we talk about organs, we could talk about them in terms of, as you're saying, their localization. So the heart's sort of there, whatever. But what makes a heart is the fact that it pumps blood, right? So its function is the thing that you want to sort of keep your eye on. And then again, you have specialized cells and structures in there that contribute to that function. The way I would put it is this. Look, the fact about engineering, doing stuff, is that you tend to be able to get more function out of a tool if it's specialized. And this is why, when you look in your garage and you see what you've got down there, you've got, 17 different hammers and you've got 4 different kinds of drills, you've got 7 wrenches. You don't have one tool that does everything. You have to have different shapes because those different shapes are good at doing certain kinds of things in the world. And that exact idea applies to information processing. And again, that's, you can see this in the way that people code is when you build code, you want to build things which are specialized just to do that one little thing. And then you can build out from there, accumulating. I used to use the analogy of a smartphone, right? So that's an information processing system that's also specialized for various reasons. People do or don't like that particular thing. But if you look at your phone these days, it's got lots of apps on there, information processing device that do one thing. Maybe they do your email, or maybe they, tell you about the weather, or they, allow you to post to X or whatever it is. So I think the analogy is perfectly good. And I think when people think about it that way, you're like, oh, yes, all parts of my body are specialized. You don't have any organ in yourself that's just like in your body that just does stuff. No, everything does something.
So then the question is is there specific evidence that you could point to that suggests that the mind is like this? Because right now we have a plausible case for it. We've somewhat argued why this would make sense, but is there empirical evidence that specifically points to the modular mind being true over the monolithic theory of the mind?
So, I mean, I think in some level the ship has sailed. What your example of visual system, I think there's no doubt that we now have dissected the visual system to the extent that we know not just that there's a whole bunch of functional components in your head that don't do vision, but that each one of those subcomponents has a job. The retina starts to do the work, turning light into electrical energy, and then you have edge detectors, and then you have the object recognition. And then, so it seems to be that ship has already sailed. We know there's specialized structures in there. And you have some things for the senses. You have hearing. You have systems in your head that move your muscles around. You have systems in your head that are controlling breathing. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. Where things get sticky is we have to look in particular claims. So, I think the classic case about cheater detection was one area where some people thought humans are just good at logical reasoning, and then other people said, no, they're specifically good at detecting cheaters. And then the only way to arbitrate these claims is to run clever studies, ideally experiments. They don't have to be experimentals. They can just be measurements. But and then, you need to put two different ideas against one another, ideally, and see which pattern of evidence more closely matches the predicted results. So in this sense, this is one area that I've occasionally found mystifying. I'm sure some of your viewers, or at least viewers of some podcasts, for some reason in the past, and E.O. Wilson used to put up with this too, is that people say, well, you can't really test evolutionary ideas. And I think the intuition is that they think that we're saying, I can tell you what happened 2 million years ago. But of course, that's not what I'm saying. I can say, I think humans have a specialized system for X, detecting cheaters or identifying a good mate or, protecting offspring because whatever. So, the issue is how can you test hypotheses, many of which were going to be derived from some notion about the evolved function of some part of the architecture. And as you said, it's not a claim that it's here, here, or here. The claim is about what its information processing features are. How does it process information? Not where is it? So the mind. I think that Steve Pinker used to say that, the mind and the neurons and so on. They're all squishy. They look like roadkill. They can be spread all over the place. But just because things are spread all over the place, don't mean that if they're connected, they don't do something really special and really specialized. That's the key piece.
I'd point to an interesting example. I just connected this in my head because I've always thought of these as non-overlapping magisteria in terms of science. Like one is neuroscience and one is evolutionary theory. But obviously, you would expect that if you're modeling reality in both cases, they should overlap. And this is kind of a tie-in from happiness research, from evolutionary psychology, and reward neuroscience. So there in the brain, there's what's known as the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. This is between the nucleus accumbens and the ventral striatum, if I'm not mistaken. Correction. Turns out I was, in fact, mistaken. What I meant to say was ventral tegmental area, but I said ventral striatum. Back to the episode. And what this is responsible for, despite being called a reward pathway, is actually for desire and motivation, the urge to do something. And then we find that there are areas such as hedonic hotspots in the brain, which are, rather than being modulated by dopamine, they're modulated by primarily opioids, also endocannabinoids. And if this is very technical for a listener, don't worry, the details don't matter. Basically, the point is that in the brain, there are two separate areas, kind of, because they overlap to a reasonable degree, and they're kind of spread throughout the brain. They go into the frontal cortex and everything, or at least the dopamine reward pathways. It's one of them does. These are overlapping, yet they're distinct in function. One of them is responsible for wanting, one of them is responsible for liking. And then you find that things like Daniel Gilbert's phenomenon of miswanting, where people will want something that they expect will make them happy, yet it doesn't. This is because wanting and liking are disconnected. So it would make at least some sense to me that things in the brain can be overlapping, as these systems are, to my knowledge, because I'm only a neuroscience amateur, that these areas can be spread all over the brain and overlapping, yet the functions are distinct And then you'll come into some kinds of conflicts between modules, such as wanting something that you expect you will be rewarded for, that you are in fact rewarded for less than or not at all. So I expect that other modules are something like this. They can be, in terms of physical reality, interconnected like crazy, yet in terms of actual function, distinct.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I would say, look, I mean, somehow, whatever information processing some modular system does, it has to be implemented in neural tissue somehow. We are still puzzling that out. And by we, I mean humans, not you and I. But and it's complicated. But by the same token, and it's always going to turn out to be true that there's going to be modular systems that have, as you say, overlapping subsystems. So there's going to be populations of neurons that are getting used in both of these kinds of systems. Again, I like software, and part of this is because for reasons that are not important. I recently developed a couple of apps. And in that development, you really start to get accustomed to the idea that you might have some subroutine that might or might not live within another subroutine, but certainly might get called. And you got to think really carefully about, how to specify the parameters so that any other system, any other procedure that's going to call that, you want to make sure you're sending the right generality of parameters into that new system. So assuming that humans are something like that, and I have no idea if we are, if that's going to turn out to be a good analogy or not, I bet it probably is in some cases. Yeah, you're going to have these functions that are going to take parameters from two different modular systems, and they're going to do their thing with it and send them back. And what that's going to look like is that you've got these two processes which are both using this subroutine. They're just using it in slightly different ways because of the parameter passing. And that's going to make things complicated. Look, I mean, the bottom line of so much of this is the framework of functional specialization is helpful. It can help you design experiments. It can help you think about the neuroscience, but it's never going to be easy. And so there's going to be all sorts of complexities in there that are going to be worked out for, decades and decades.
So I have tried not to do this, and yet it always ends up happening. We ended up moving into the abstract and complicated. So let's move to practical applications of this theory, or things that from normal life that we can understand. I want to talk to you about self-control. This part of the book I thought was great. It was very interesting, of your book, which is the rare book that I actually have, because I tend to listen in audio format, but this one wasn't an audiobook. Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite. Great book. I expected it to be good, but I was pleasantly surprised. Tell me about self-control. So you could start with a history if you'd like.
First of all, thank you for those kind words. I appreciate it. Thanks for buying a physical copy of the book. As you say, no one ever has a physical copy of anything anymore. So yeah, the history is I think it's kind of interesting. I got onto this because of this idea that was developed by a scholar named Roy Baumeister. He said, okay, people have this resource in their head, and as you do something effortful, it gets used up, and therefore, because you have less of the resource, exerting self-control becomes more and more difficult. A kind of a hydraulic view or a substance view. And I remember hearing that. I mean, I guess I can say this out loud now, but I remember hearing that, and that struck me as wildly unlikely. The idea that there was some mysterious substance in your head that get used up. And so I got interested in the idea. I looked at some of the work. I should say, by the way, that at the time that I started doing this work, this kind of view, the resource view, the willpower view, was the mainstream. It was the received wisdom in psychology. I believe that with some tiny little exceptions and some rearguard actions, the field has moved on. I encourage people who are interested in the area to read Mickey Inslicht. He has a Substack for those people who are interested in this. So that struck me as odd. But
yeah, he wrote a great article on that.
Yeah, he's a smart guy. So one question that this raised in my head, which I thought was an interesting question, was there is something aversive about doing certain kinds of tasks. And this requires stepping back a little bit. So normally when something is aversive, that's evolution's way of telling you to stop, right? So like you stick your hand in a fire, it's unpleasant. That's evolution's way of saying stop. But what's weird about effort is that often you feel unpleasant even when you're doing something which is useful and, like going to be your work, which could be helpful, or I don't know, you're doing some calculations for your job or whatever it is. And I thought that is kind of interesting. Like, why does it feel bad to exert sort of mental effort by that I mean to do some task. And this goes back to specialization. So my story was a little bit different, which is the thing about most of our modular systems, which we've talked about, is that they're very specialized. They have one job, but we have really fancy systems in our head, working memory or whatever you want to call it. And you can only do one thing at once, right? So if you're going to plan your next holiday, you can't simultaneously be multiplying 2 3-digit numbers together. You have some systems in your head that can only do one thing at a time. I use the analogy of it's your hand. Like if you're holding a pen in your hand, you can't be throwing a baseball with it. So this brings up a concept near and dear to my heart, which is opportunity costs.
Spoken like a true economist adjacent individual.
Yeah, I mean I did a postdoc with Vernon Smith at the University of Arizona. He's a well-known economist.
That explains it.
Yeah, so I spent 2 years living with economists and then another year sort of econ adjacent. So yeah, you can see that in the way I think about stuff. So one way to think about what you're doing when you're exerting mental effort, when you're doing something like multiplying things together or studying, whatever, is that there's other stuff that you're not doing. So the next best thing you could be doing with your fancy working memory that has some value to you, a reward value, like you were just talking about the dopaminergic system, the reward system. So one way to think about it is, if you're using your fancy system to do X, evolution is built a little subsystem in there that asks the following. It just asks this question. It's like, are you sure you still want to keep doing this? Like, is this a good way for you to be spending your fancy cognitive resources, or is there something better you could be doing? This is why many of you who are watching this or listening to it, as you're listening to it, you're considering, maybe not consciously, maybe I'll check my phone. Maybe I got a new like on Facebook. Maybe someone just posted something on X that was interesting. I wonder if there's a new Instagram picture, whatever it is people do with Instagram. That's the opportunity cost. That's the other thing you could be doing with your time and attention. So my view of effort is it's evolution's way of basically saying, are you sure you want to keep doing this? Or maybe is there something more rewarding that you'd rather do? Notice how different that is from a resource view. Like you run out of something. No, it's not that there's some stuff that's not there anymore. It's that there's some calculation that's changing over time. And that's a big distinction between the kind of view that I have and the sort of view that someone like a Roy Baumeister has.
And Baumeister's theory is the theory of ego depletion, the idea that willpower is finite, that you can run out of the stuff of willpower, which was later identified, or at least supposedly identified, to be glucose. Would you be willing to say that the nail in the coffin for ego depletion is there, that this theory is just done, it's gone, it's false?
I mean, as much as any theory has suffered falsification, it seems to me that one has. I think, again, Mickey Inslicht has a nice piece yesterday or the day before in which he asks, is psychology really data-driven? And one of the examples he uses is this, is like, how much more evidence do you need? And there, I think there's two pieces that are important to talk about. One was the very large effort at replication, which showed essentially no effect. And the other one was a meta-analysis, so an analysis of other analyses of all of the work in the area. Now, that was a little murky because there were a couple different analyses, but more or less the one that I think is quite good, once again, shows that there's no effect. I don't know what else we're supposed to need. Again, if there's no effect, then you should find null results. It's very difficult to prove a negative, but if you keep looking for something and over and over and over and you don't find it, I don't know what else would motivate you to start looking in a different direction.
And you'd think psychologists would be better about motivated reasoning, but I suppose it's human nature.
You would think so. I think that was one of the biggest and toughest lessons for my scholarly career, which is, I would say more generally, it's not just psychologists, but more or less, is that, psychologists and other scientists, they're human and they're subject to all kinds of biases. And this, for sure, this is an important one, and it really has, in my opinion, undermined the progress of the social sciences, probably for since the social sciences emerged.
So back to ego depletion, they did find, I don't know if this part replicated, but that giving glucose to subjects who had done a difficult task, whatever the difficult task may be, perhaps it's a cognitive task, perhaps it's resisting something, they start to get weaker and weaker willpower as time goes on. Yet if they're given a glucose drink, suddenly their ability to withstand increases. Has that even replicated? And if so, what do we make of that?
I don't know if that's replicated, but let me tell you about another study on that note. So, and this, by the way, was one of the studies that led me in the subsequent direction that I went. So they did that study, but for people on a bicycle, one of these freestanding bicycles, a stationary bicycle. So some people were on the bicycle and they got water, and some people got a glucose solution or sugar solution, and some people swished the glucose around and spit it out. Now notice that the spitting out condition, they don't get any more glucose in their system. They're spitting the liquid out. They show increased capacity pedaling their bike that parallels the people who drank the glucose solution. What this suggests to me is that it's not the glucose that did it, it's the reward that did it, right? So people are getting some kind of interesting reward, whether it's mental effort or physical effort, that seems to have an effect on subsequent performance. So even if you found that result, you wouldn't be able to reject the hypothesis that it wasn't glucose, that in fact it was the reward. And on that note, if there's any piece of this hypothesis that I am quite confident is not true, the idea that glucose is the substrate of the willpower substance, again, I mean, I have a paper on this where I reanalyzed the initial data, and that reanalysis, so I argue that the initial analyses were done incorrectly on that manuscript, and my reanalysis, to me, suggests there's just nothing there. So I would encourage your audience to look elsewhere for an explanation for why people find tasks effortful and what's going to help them persevere. On that note, a really helpful thing is to get rid of distractions. That's why getting rid of distractions is easy, because it makes the temptations lower, which makes effort feel less effortful.
And when you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. So clearly, I think that's the nail in the coffin for the glucose idea, is that you don't even have to actually consume the glucose for it to work. So that seems to suggest that it's a signal to your mind, to your brain. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. This is something that intuitively made sense to me, although this might be hindsight bias. But when I read in your book that the acquisition of a reward was essentially the way of telling your brain you're on the right track, and then thus replenishing your willpower to continue. That just makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if you're doing something that's totally fruitless, it would be rather foolish as far as costs and benefits go to just keep going. And I think that the problem with us nowadays is that we still have our present bias, which served us back in the ancestral environment, where you have to worry about getting food today and getting sexual reproduction today or tomorrow because you might die. Whereas today, in the modern day, we are now investing money for 20 years out, 40 years out. We're trying not to get overweight so that we don't die in our 60s instead of our 70s, it's so far away that it makes sense that when you're putting effort into something like that, your brain essentially gets the input of no rewards. Like, this is aversive. I could be stuffing packets of dense calories down my gullet, but instead I'm doing something for no perceived reward, such as dieting. So this made perfect sense to me. When I read it, I thought, that sounds like a far more plausible explanation of willpower than the ego depletion model, which has just been, it's like an airship that's been poked with a bunch of holes. It's falling, if not fallen.
Yeah, and again, as you say, I think that the nail's in the coffin. There is an interesting question about why it persists. And again, there's other models that are like that. Stereotype threat is like that, where it doesn't seem to matter how many times the result is undermined. I think it's an important question for as the modern moment, and as people like you inherit science and people like me kind of go off to pasture, what would we have to do to improve the practice of science, to make scientists more responsive to the evidence? There's this, I think it was an economist or maybe it was a physicist who said that science proceeds or advances one funeral at a time. And there's something to that. One does get the sense that I've known scholars who I'm sure will not give up their flawed ideas ever. They're just unlikely to relent. So it's an interesting question. How can we change things in such a way that, scholars are better able to let go of their ideas? And that's a hard question. We need to change the incentive somehow. And I leave that to wiser heads than mine.
And frankly, it just makes perfect sense not to abandon an idea that's your claim to fame, your claim to grants, tenure, and status and prestige and all these things. If I were Baumeister and I had an idea that made me as famous as his made him, I would be extremely reluctant to give that up. It just makes perfect sense. I mean, the incentives are right there for keeping it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably it. Yeah. And that's a good question, right? So how do we change the incentives? How do we change the status scheme? And it's hard. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, I'll leave that problem to somebody more educated on the subject than I. Now, you talked about different modules influencing you to behave in different ways. How does the supremacy of one module over another work? So assuming that we have all these modules in our heads, if the person is still here and has accepted the conclusion, how are the models that are in, or the modules in charge, determined as opposed to the other ones that are now dormant or inactive or weaker, I suppose?
Yeah, such a great question. And I'm going to be very clear. I have no idea. I mean, I don't have no idea, but if I knew the answer to that, I would, whatever, then I would win a Nobel Prize. So here's one way to think about it. So, like you're walking through the world and you smell, roasted garlic, and then the systems that are designed to motivate you to eat, suddenly they have a little bit more pull in terms of their control of your behavior. And particularly if you also happen to be hungry, then those guys are in charge. On the other hand, if you're walking around and you smell some garlic and then there's a bear in front of you or next to you or behind you, the modules that are designed to take evasive action, those guys are in control. So one way to think of it, and in the past, people have talked about a so-called screaming demon model where these different modular systems, they're all kind of yelling into some central space. Think of it as consciousness. And they're kind of yelling at a level that corresponds to how urgent their particular thing is, right? So, you see a nice, there's a pie over there, and then there's a bear over there, and there's an attractive maid over there. And all those systems are active, but at the end of the day, you've got to do one or the other, right? You can't simultaneously do these things. And so there's something about the design of those systems, and here's where it gets complicated, that somehow the organism has to be able to convert all of those different exigencies, all of those different motivations into a common currency so it can pick among them. So there has to be like the dollar of consciousness. There's some units in there that somehow get compared. Is it more important to eat that pie or run away from that bear? I mean, that example is a little silly because, the bear, but not always. I mean, there's this great video of these two, I think they're antelope, but they're two organisms with antlers and they're two males and they're fighting with each other. And that's very important. And this lion just runs right up to him. It's not like it's approaching from stealth. It's running and just attacks one and eats it. It's like, there the system that said, I've got to compete with the male was active more than the system that says I've got to monitor, be vigilant for predators. So the short version is it's got to be something like that where somehow there's different levels of urgencies. So, as you get hungrier and hungrier, your attention focuses more and more on finding food, right? And then in the limit, if you can't breathe, the only thing you care about, it's like the slogan, right? When you can't breathe, nothing else matters. So our modular systems have ways to express themselves in consciousness that, somehow is going to, communicate to some central system how much more important its current task is than the other alternatives. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had a few ideas while you were saying that. For one, perhaps that at least partially explains. I'd expect some of it to be explained for social purposes so that you can judge a person as one person because it doesn't make sense to judge them as sub-selves in terms of moral responsibility, but I'll get to that later. Perhaps this is at least in part responsible for the perceived unitariness of our minds, is that we can only behave in one way at any given time. And then that leads me to think about how neurons behave. The way neurons behave is they'll communicate to each other either, this is really simplified, but exciting them, meaning increasing the likelihood that the neurons are communicating with will fire, or inhibiting them, which is decreasing the odds that they'll fire. So I'd expect that whatever the I suppose the neural correlate of the module is, you'd expect that depending on the stimuli the brain is getting from the external world or from the internal world, interoception, that kind of thing, or from memories, that the neurons responsible for certain modules would be more excited, and then the less relevant ones would either be inhibited or just not have as much neural activity there. So that could be perhaps a way that modules win over other ones, just more excitation, less inhibition. Actually, that's probably what it has to be, just how neurons work, to my knowledge.
Now, as I said, it's almost got to be something like that, right? Like those are the tools that the system has to work with, right? So excitatory and inhibitory. So you can imagine as you get hungry, not only are you exciting the go get food things, but you're probably inhibiting the mating systems or whatever. And it's sort of, to me, it feels that way, which isn't great evidence, but it is true. Like, when you're really hungry, you just don't care that much about the other possible things you might be doing. You're like, no, I really want to eat. Yes, there's that TV show, and yeah, I could go hang out with my friends, but man, am I hungry. So that sort of feels like the analog of these excitatory versus inhibitory processes. So I agree, it's going to be something like that.
That's exactly what you'd expect from an evolutionary perspective. You said that you didn't know for sure why some models or some modules gain supremacy over other ones at given times. But just from an evolutionary perspective, I would expect that a part of it is stimuli from the external world. So whatever your context is at the moment, just because that's how animals and organisms in general know things, chemicals, chemicals entering the nose, olfaction, tasting things, seeing, hearing. So you'd expect the context to influence which modules are active. You'd probably also expect history, your knowledge, your prior experience to activate which modules are active. So that, for example, there are a lot of lions. So maybe you, in your environment on the savannah, let's say. So when you go out to the savannah without your friends, maybe you're more active looking for lions. Whereas if I went out into the savannah, or not savannah, but out onto my lawn, my threat detection systems would be very low, despite not seeing predators, just like maybe people in the savannah wouldn't see predators. Yet my history informs me that the likelihood of an actual predator right there is basically zero. So that's probably what I'd nominate for the causes of different modules being more active than others. It's probably context and history, if I had to guess.
Let me go one further on that, because I think this is a super interesting and important potential idea. So imagine that you're in a war zone for a year, right? And in that kind of a context, you want to set your detection for possible danger quite low. If there's loud noise, that's a really good indication that, now you need to be vigilant because the enemy might be nearby. Now, in an age in which you can fly from a war zone to a supermarket in the space of 12 hours, what is it going to look like to have an organism that's been just calibrated by constant vigilance because of the constant mortal danger put into a very normal context? By that, I simply mean peacetime, whatever.
Civilian context.
Yeah, civilian context. Could that go some way to explaining why PTSD is so much more common now? Is because we have this world in which people are taken from one context and rapidly moved to another. In ancestral environments, probably things didn't change that fast, right? So maybe hostilities waxed and waned, but you weren't like in a war zone 1 minute and then in a grocery store the next. So what you're saying, I think what's going on is, as you say, our history calibrates our sensitivity to lots of different features of the environment. And then as people move from one environment to another, it can look a little pathological. So that kind of idea, I think, is a very powerful way to start thinking about, why are we seeing some of what looks like pathology in humans? And part of that is because we're switching contexts so fast.
So basically, if our brain is an instrument, our history tunes it, and then the context plays it, you'd say?
Totally. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I like that. So because you have to get tuned over in the course of development, right? You got to know what kind of a world you're in.
That's what learning is.
Exactly. So you got to learn, am I in a world with lots of allies? Am I in a world with lots of food? And that's going to calibrate you in terms of how you're going to day-to-day interact with the world. And that's I think a really important lesson from the perspective of how does development look from an evolutionary point of view. We would expect development, learning, culture to cause changes in the mind that are going to be adaptive. That is, that are going to calibrate the organism to be able to thrive in the context in which it finds itself.
So to put the cap on self-control, self-discipline, since drinking a little lemonade is probably out, or eating a little candy. I mean, maybe it would work if you spit out the lemonade or something. What can we do using this knowledge of modules to be more effectively self-disciplined, to let the modules responsible for long-term rewards, let's say, overcome those responsible for short-term rewards?
This is an area where I think the empirical research in some ways even got ahead of or ran in parallel to the theory. So there are various techniques. So my former colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Angela Duckworth, has talked a lot about grit and how do you get gritty. So just to take a couple of examples, right? So one thing that I think is important and fits is that, in those contexts, one way that you can be more gritty, you could persevere, is to make the distractions less salient, right? So you can, hide your cell phone or put it in a, Faraday pouch or whatever they're called. You can, or, there's other aspects of it too. You can, particularly in the modern world, you can provide incentives for you to persist on your task. So tell a partner, look, if I finish this chapter, then we're having, steak for dinner. And if I don't, then we're going to have eggplant or, whatever. The thing is, you can change your environment to take account of the fact that, there are ways in which you're potentially going to be distracted, and there's going to be incentives to which you respond. I mean, for me, I try to keep, windows closed as I'm working, because I know, if I'm trying to get some editing done or some writing done, if I make it too easy for me to check my email, then I'm going to do that. I'm going to make it, or too easy to, see if something in the news has happened. So you have to plan a little bit, right? That's the main thing, is you have to plan for the future. So our short-term modules, the ones you were talking about, right? I want to eat potato chips, and I don't want to work out, and I want to eat candy. But, if I don't have potato chips or candy in the house, then I'm not going to be able to succumb to that temptation. So I think effort's the same thing. You want to try to build your world in a way that rewards you for maintaining your effort and makes it difficult for you to sort of get distracted by something which is more quote unquote rewarding.
And to use kind of an equation-like way of thinking, we could do history plus context equals behavior, output, result, whatever it is. To think about that more simply, back to the instrument, I assume that you could tune your instrument differently through habit, for example. That would probably, it would reduce the effort. Having a habit of, let's say, going to the gym would reduce the effort of going to the gym. For example, for me, it's totally effortless for me to go to the gym, because that just happens to be my history. I've been doing it for long enough that now I don't have to do any tricks. I just think, oh, it's time to go to the gym, and I just go. So that would be tuning the instrument differently. And then, of course, you could alter the history. That's one variable in the equation. You could also alter the context. This is the plethora of findings in behavioral science, such as and behavioral economics. Case in point, Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. Changing your environment changes what you do. And this makes perfect sense. You change the context, and then whichever modules the context is elevating or suppressing changes. So if I have cookies sitting right outside my room on the counter, suddenly my dense calorie package module is going to go hyperactive and say, oh, just one, come on. So I assume that altering the context to make the instant gratification, so to speak, less rewarding to your mind, and then making the long-term goal more rewarding would allow for easier self-control, because I assume your willpower, rather than being like you have your cup of willpower and it slowly empties as you use it, I would assume that the amount of willpower you have is totally dependent on which modules are or are not active at any given time. So it makes sense that changing things like the history of, your history with whatever context, and then also the context itself in the present moment would alter your outcomes willpower-wise.
I think that's great. I would just add one friendly amendment, which is, yes, you can change your environment, as you say, you get tuned, but more and more, I think we're going to have to talk about how you can also change yourself. So here I have in mind, some of the new medications that are prescribed for people who want to lose weight. And those medications, they're not changing the context, they're changing you, right? They're changing, it's something like how rewarding the food is, or what your motivation is to eat, or something. I don't exactly understand it in detail how they work. But that's going to happen more and more, right? That we're going to have this option to change something inside of us, our minds, our bodies, and so on. Because at the end of the day, right, that's all we are. Is this, we're the physical stuff. And if you can change the physical stuff, well, then you can also change, what choices the thing makes. So I totally agree with you. Change your context, change, you could reframe things, you could change your environment, but more and more the drugs are going to change us, and we're going to be able to decide, it's weird, right? To think I can change myself in a way that I am less motivated to eat food. If you put it that way, you sort of feel like, like in some ways I'm sort of a different person. And then you say, well, what else can I change my motivation about? Can I change my motivation to want to work? Can I change my motivation to go to the gym? Can I change, you know what I mean? And I haven't thought through this stuff. This is all very new to me because I haven't really thought about Ozempic as it relates to this broader issue of modular dynamics. But what if we can change how our different modular systems are calibrated with respect to one another? Again, I don't have an answer for this. I'm just throwing this out there as an idea because my guess is we're going to have to, as a culture, decide how we want to think about that.
And I think you're exactly right. And actually, I'm a bit disappointed that I didn't think about that. But it makes total sense because really what the history context thing is, and if there are other variables, well, I just didn't think of them. But these two variables for which module is active, they are working on our hardware. And just the way we, for example, organize our environment or build habits, that's altering the hardware or altering the processes occurring in our hardware at any given moment. But you're right that directly tampering with the hardware is you're just skipping the middleman there of the environment or whatever it is. You're just going right in and altering which modules are active. And I think that's something I'm really excited about for the future in terms of science and technology, the development. I'm just looking forward for the time when people can alter their biology in very favorable ways. And I hope that happens within my lifetime. That'd be very exciting and just a great world to live in, I think.
Yeah, it'll raise interesting issues of free will and identity and so on. But yes, I think, as you say, in your generation, we'll start to wrestle with all sorts of interesting ways that people can sort of change themselves. I mean, there was the beginnings of this to some extent. Recreational drug use in some ways is going right after the hardware, and one can take whatever position one wants on that. But again, with the dawn of Ozempic and increased knowledge in general about what's going on in neuroscience, I could imagine, that your world becomes quite different from the one that I inhabited.
Yeah, and things like well-being and health. So I suppose well-being in the subjective well-being sense, like happiness, and then health, those could just be directly targeted. And it's already happening to a certain extent. And I guess, recreational drugs are kind of like a subjective well-being interaction thing, aside from the fact that we haven't been able to figure out how not to make them screw up our futures. But I mean, if there were some recreational drug with no long-term consequences, that would be an interesting thing to unleash upon the world.
Yeah. And again, that's why cultures are going to have to try to wrestle with these questions. I mean, as a philosophical matter, what do we want to do? And I just to say, it's also worth bearing in mind that, again, the human mind is designed to respond to cues in the world rather than the world as it is. So, for example, we want to build a world in which we get positive feedback about who we are and people who like us and so on. The reason I mention this is I have another sort of, not really a hobby, but I've been thinking a little bit about the role of AIs, right? So now that there's these AIs that you could start to build that are kind of like your friends, they send you text messages, maybe they have a physical appearance in your computer. And then you got this human who's like, well, I want to be in a world in which I have, 3 people who think I'm awesome and are super interesting and say fun things to me and whatever. And now if I build those as agents in a machine, and then I don't leave the house because I've got all my close friends right here on my, on my video screen, how's that going to change the way we interact in the real world and with each other? So so that's not changing yourself. That's changing, if you will, your percept. That's changing the environment, that the sort of the virtual environment, however you want to put it. Because mostly we don't get to choose the environment that we live, right? You can buy a house, you can have paintings around, but you don't get to choose what your friends are like. They choose that. Well, now you can. I don't know what that looks like. I think that's also very scary.
And my initial thought was, what? That'll never happen. I mean, I didn't think that, but that won't happen because people will know it's fake. But then I thought about pornography. we've already figured out how to make technology that we know is fake, yet it pushes our evolutionary buttons enough that it doesn't matter. It gives us the responses we want, even if in some cases it's sort of like an ersatz, a lesser replication, kind of like in the case of pornography versus sex. But I see no good reason why we couldn't just keep improving those things until they become just a equivalent to the real thing and just take its place.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, so like something like, artificial sweeteners like that, right? So it's not sugar, but from our perspective, we're like, oh, that tastes good. I want more of that. So I don't see AI friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, partners, or whatever, as that different from artificial sweetener. It's just giving us the stimulus that we want, even though behind it, there's no reality. Again, yeah, I leave it to your generation to figure out what to do with that.
I am not looking forward to figuring that one out, especially not for my kids.
Yeah.
So let's turn this a bit social, since sociality, as evolutionary psychology says, is something people care about a lot. This one doesn't seem to be social on its face, but it seems that it might be. Tell me about self-esteem. What's the psychological literature say on that front?
Yeah, so self-esteem is complicated, of course. So back in the day when I started my graduate work in the 90s, self-esteem was viewed as this thing that people seek, right? So they want to feel good about themselves, which is probably true. But a collaborator of Roy Baumeister, who we mentioned earlier, in working with a guy named Mark Leary, had a different view of it, which is my view, which is the way to think about self-esteem is sort of like a gas gauge. It's how well you're doing. So if you've got a lot of friends and you're healthy and so on, that's evolution's way of saying whatever you've been doing, that good feeling you get, keep doing that. So as we've been discussing, reward is evolution's way of telling you to do the same thing. Punishment is evolution's way of that, or I should say, the unpleasant sensations associated with various kinds of stimuli are evolution's way of saying, stop doing that, don't do that again. So I think of it, Mark Leary called this the sociometer. It's the measure of your social standing. And that's quite a different view. So he kind of draws this analogy. He's like, people don't want their gas gauge to go up. They want more gas. That is to say, they don't want to just chase self-esteem. They don't want a ribbon that says, you participated, great. They want to win a race, right? They want to actually have the esteem of their fellows, their social world. And this is a powerful idea. My view is that Lee Kirkpatrick, a friend of mine, he expanded this idea and says, well, there's actually lots of different, speaking of specialization, you've got a sort of a meter that measures how appealing are you as a mate? How appealing are you in the work world? How appealing are you as a friend? How trustworthy do people think you are? So it's sort of like a lot of different meters, more like an airplane than a car, where there's tons of different gauges. And then self-esteem is evolution's way of sort of summarizing how well you're doing. And I think that's a very powerful way to think about it. Notice then the goal is not just again, you're not going to chase self-esteem. We should tell people to chase the sorts of things for which others will value you. Become an entrepreneur, become an expert, learn how to play the viola very well, be a good friend, be generous, be trustworthy, so on. And if you cultivate those characteristics, then your self-esteem will go up, not artificially, but because you're valued by others. I think of it as sort of, how do I measure how you are measuring my value? So my meter is actually measuring your meter, which is complicated, but I think that's probably the way it works, right? And that's also why we get such a big, in your case, you get a bunch of 200 new followers on your channel, whether it's YouTube or whatever platform you're on. You're like, oh, there's a bunch of people who value me enough to subscribe to my thing, and that makes me happy. So that I think is a good way to kind of conceptualize self-esteem and that positive feeling that you get when others value you.
To connect this to a non-academic perspective, my first guest on my podcast was a man named Greg Denning, and he was a mentor of mine, still is, but he began as my mentor unofficially. I met him, and we ended up developing a mentor-mentee relationship when I was 13 years old. And he's big into self-help. He's dabbled in science as well, but he's not a full-blown academic. But I remember hearing him say at one point that the way to have self-respect is to do respectable things. And that makes perfect sense. And that reminds me that my immediate thought was Mark Leary's idea of the sociometer theory. Makes perfect sense. Yeah, exactly. Because what is it that makes something respectable such that you have self-respect? the thing that makes something respectable is that people respect it. And right there, you can see the social influence. People respect it. And what do people respect? Things that generally we evolve to confer status upon another for. Things like prestige.
Totally, yeah. You want to. Another way to think of it is like, what is a job? A job is basically, and ideally, it's usually something where I generate value for some set of other people, and to the extent that I generate a lot of value, I'm going to make more money. To the extent I generate less value, I'm going to make less money. And self-esteem is kind of like it's like your salary, right? It's like, how much value am I generating, and because other people are keeping track of that. And as you know, it's obviously hugely domain, specific to the culture, right? In some places, knowing how to hunt or knowing how to row or whatever is going to be super valuable. And then that's going to change, and that's part of development too. Is figuring out, okay, well, how can I be valuable in this society to other people in this culture? And that's a lot of what human development is figuring that kind of stuff out.
To bring a story that is not going to be relatable to most people, or at least it may be relatable in retrospect. When I was in middle school, I was homeschooled for most of my life. So when I entered middle school, I thought, I want to have a lot of friends and I want to be popular and I want to get the girls and all that. So how do I do that? And I found that I would get nervous talking to people. So I thought, I know what I have to do. I have to raise my self-esteem. So I look into self-help, and I started testing for a very, very brief period of time, things like affirmations. And it was just total nonsense. It didn't do anything. And then one day I had the fortune of encountering evolutionary psychology, and I realized, wait a second, I can actually do things that change my real world outcomes. And that, in my opinion, actual competence in any given thing confers confidence like nothing else. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. What is it that rewards you? Real outcomes, or at least simulating real outcomes, such as pornography, for example.
Yeah, I have one of my close friends from graduate school, his name is Shawnee Robbins. He's one of the other people who writes with me on our Substack, The Living Fossils, and he uses movies in his practice, in part because he takes the view, which I sort of think is right, that movies contain all of this wisdom, sometimes more than scholarly psychology. I just remember Napoleon Dynamite. He's got this line, he's like, women want boyfriends with skills. And there's something kind of simple but very true about that. To your point, it's like, yeah, you cultivated some skills. That's a cool thing. And I don't want to say that self-affirmations don't have any value. I think probably there's some value to it. But yeah, saying you're awesome and you're great, that's okay, maybe that's good. But man, doing something awesome and doing something great, well, that seems to me more likely to lead to the kind of social success that people are interested in cultivating.
I can almost feel my mentor, Greg, clapping his hands in the air and saying, yes, exactly. So to transition to a different, similar-ish subject, tell me about self-deception, your favorite term, of course.
Yeah. So again, there's a storied history here. I think that most of what happened in the self-deception literature is that people didn't really define it carefully. So there's a guy who wrote a book about self-deception, Robert Trivers.
Folly of Fools.
Yeah, Folly of Fools. But he, is best known. He developed the theory of reciprocal altruism and parental investment theory. I mean, genius, absolute genius. But he wrote this whole book, Folly of Fools, and I wrote a review of it, pretty favorable review of it. But I pointed out, as gently as I could, he never defined it in the book. And this has been the problem with self-deception. People have this intuition about what it means. So for me, I did try to define it, which is something like so your modules have what are kind of psychologists call representations, which you can, like beliefs or something like that. So my view is that self-deception is a case where you have one module that has one belief in it and another module that has a different belief in it, and the two cannot simultaneously be the case. And usually the one over here has some value in terms of its propaganda purposes. So it's useful for persuasion. So generally, brains should have representations in them that are true. The one exception to that is when you're trying to persuade someone. So if you don't know me very well and I behave as if I have the belief that I'm an excellent driver or whatever you want to say, you might come to believe that. I mean, you ever see me drive, but I seem pretty confident in it. Oh. And to our point earlier, you're like, yeah, he must be a pretty good driver, and I like to have friends who know how to drive. So that's good for me because now you want to be my friend. But really, I have another system in my head, another module that maybe has to do with my behavior, which is, hey, do you want to try this Formula One car? and go 120 miles per hour in it, you're an excellent driver after all. And so my behavior will then be, you know what, I have this thing, I would, but I have this other thing. So your behavior is being driven by the true belief, but the propaganda is being, now you might even not know, like whatever, this module might not know that the reason for my deferring, not wanting to get in the car has to do with the fact that I'm not actually a good driver. And that's the part where it's sort of, there is some self-deception there. There's like, it's something like you have two representations, one of which is something like the truth. This one is the propaganda, and they can't both be the same. The problem with self-deception is that often people just mean like they're wrong about something. And that to me is not, that doesn't seem like self-deception. That just means someone's wrong about something. And I don't find that framework very helpful. So, and I should just be clear. People are free to define terms however they want. That's the way I define it, and I think that's the most useful way to think about it.
So then the question that follows from that is, why would this exist at all from an evolutionary perspective? Because if I get up right now and I believe that my door's open, all I'm going to end up with is a very sore nose once I run headlong into the door. Doesn't make any sense. So why would anything approximating self-deception exist at all?
So my view on this is that there's only one function that this phenomenon can serve, and that's persuasion. The only reason not to have a true belief, because true beliefs are good for behaving, like you say, if you have a false belief about the door being open, you're going to hit your nose. And so everything else equal, and it's very weird when having a false belief can be an advantage. But the one case would be persuasion. So when there's limited information in the world, and in the driving case, you don't really have much about whatever. You don't know much about my actual skills. If I have a false belief in my head that somehow improves your representation of my skills, abilities, traits, and so on, that can be an advantage for me. This is a point that I have tried to make in 10 different contexts, including, as you say, the book, but also some of my scholarly work, and then my blog posts. And for some reason, I don't know exactly what it is, but this is a very hard idea to get across. It's very simple. It's like you say, in the door case, true beliefs are always going to be better than false beliefs. And again, the exception is if my false belief is favorable and it causes you to have it, to copy my false belief, well, that's good for me. And so you can get it to persist. You got to be really careful, though. I mean, if that false belief spills out and affects my behavior, as you say, now I'm in trouble because now I'm acting on the basis of false beliefs, and that's not going to be optimal.
I think that in speaking to a handful of people about this already, I spoke to David Pinsoff, Dr. David Pinsoff of Everything is Bullshit, the Substack. I don't know if you know about him. Also Robin Hanson. And it seems that what it is, I think David Pinsoff has a great way of putting this, is that what we're doing is we're not really self-deceiving or deceiving other people. We're kind of bullshitting. And the way he defines that is in the Harry Frankfurt sense of bullshit, that basically we don't really have a particular regard for truth. And from an evolutionary perspective, this is what you'd predict, that we evolve to believe whatever works. In the real world, what happens to work is just a reasonably accurate map for the most part. So if I pick up a rock and believe it is an apple, the only thing that will end up in my mouth is my teeth. That's the only thing I can swallow after biting it, because that's not how it works. You don't get to just change the world with your beliefs. But in social scenarios, false beliefs can in fact be very useful. And so it makes sense. We just evolved to believe and think what works, not necessarily what is true. Evolution isn't trying to make us philosophers. It's trying to make us reproducers.
Totally agree with that. So let me say a couple things. Yeah, I know David. David was in my lab for a while, so it's not a coincidence.
Really?
Yeah, so it's not a coincidence that he and I share certain views. So, love David. I've been enjoying it. We actually edit one another's posts every now and then, so big fan. Yes, so I agree. The thing is that most of the reasons for having false beliefs, again, are social reasons. So, for example, if I'm in a certain community where I believe, I don't want to specify any particular religion, but whatever, there's an Easter bunny. And that's good for me because, other people don't want to hang out with me if I don't believe in the Easter bunny. Again, I totally agree with that. Like that is a social goal, a persuasive goal, that having a false belief about the Easter bunny, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. As long as I don't act on it, right? Like if I go hunting the Easter bunny, that's going to be just a waste of time, right? So totally agree that many of these things, I think of them as sort of psychological propaganda. By the way, it's just a little funny that because David, I think recently has been working with Marty Hazelton, and Marty Hazelton is one of the first people who talked about the benefits of false beliefs. So she had this idea that men overestimate women's interest because it's bad to miss an opportunity. My view is I find that a very strange idea. What you should do if you're a man, you should correctly estimate the possibility and simply set your threshold for acting on it lower. So I don't think she's that interested, but I don't want to miss the opportunities. So that way you actually still know how interested she is, which could be useful, particularly if there's another possibility that you might want to entertain. Like if she's this interested, if I think she's here, but she's here, now there's a woman over here, I'm like, well, I'm not going to switch. But if I correctly say, oh, well, she's down here, but I've got a better chance over there. The point is, true beliefs, I agree. Evolution has lots of use for false beliefs, mostly, again, having all to do with the social world. But true beliefs are useful, too. So I would just say, in general, you're better off accurately making estimates of other people's interests and then simply biasing your behavior, not biasing, but conditioning your behavior on that belief and simply, letting the probability be lower and then still pursue a potential mate or what have you. That's what I would say.
So basically, Mother Nature doesn't change based on your beliefs, but mother, father, friends, and foes do, and thus having advantageous beliefs that may or may not be true is useful in social context, but it's totally useless in natural context, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why, I don't want to pitch the book because that's so irritating, but I do start out with, in my ill-spent youth, I played the game Frogger from time to time. And that was getting ready to get the frog across the lanes of traffic. And there's just no sense in which you could be in an advantage in Frogger by having anything other than a true belief about your little frog's speed and the speed of the cars or whatever. So crossing the street in Frogger is a game against nature, as you put it, Mother Nature. Then there's games against people. So, for example, in Philadelphia, and this is more or less true, if you look down at your phone instead of looking at the cars, you might think you're at a disadvantage, but you're not. You're at an advantage because people in Philly will slow down if they see that you're distracted and can't get out of the way. So not looking at the cars, having no belief about oncoming traffic can be an advantage in that context. Very different from Frogger. So you're exactly right to separate games against nature and games against people. Those have very different structures and lead to different adaptations.
And looking at the drivers, at that point, their responsibility is in some sense abdicated, because if you don't get out of the way, what the hell were you doing? You saw the car and you just walked right in front of it.
Well, in Philadelphia, anytime a car hits a person, it's the driver who's in trouble. But I take your point. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But I mean, that's the driver's assumption in that moment. So if we haven't inflamed people already, let's go ahead and do that. What are the evolutionary origins of morality?
Well, this is this is another one of my favorite topics. So this is another area where, unfortunately, it gets into semantics because people have used the word to mean very different things. So I'll just tell you what I think. So when I talk about morality, I'm specifically referring to people's evaluation of candidate actions as wrong or not wrong. And that's it. So moral judgment is saying that thing was wrong. So when you crossed the street against the red light, that was wrong. When you took the lollipop from the kid, that was wrong. I don't mean virtuous. I don't mean, cooperative, as some people do. I just mean that. And I won't give you the whole thing here because I know that we've got time constraints. But by and large, here's the way I look at it. Humans cooperate in groups and they get into conflict with one another. And anytime a conflict emerges, you have to choose sides using some technique. In many cases, you could say neutral, but oftentimes you can't because we live in these social worlds in which you have to whatever. One way you can choose sides is by just picking your friend. So, recently there was an unfortunate case in which someone committed a very serious crime and a person who would normally be their closest ally, their father, turned them in. Right, because the person in question did the wrong thing, and so that was a case where they used morality. Who did the wrong thing versus loyalty to animate their choice. There's other things you can do. You can always just side with the person who's the biggest person. This is how most animals do it, right? So they just side with the alpha, because if they don't side with the alpha, they're going to get beaten down. So there's loyalty, there's side with the top dog, and then there's morality. Side with the person who did something that we call wrong. And notice that this is why we have all these different rules about morality to cover all of the different conflicts that emerge in humans. Where you can walk, what words you can say, sometimes what ideas you can think, what happens if you break a contract, whether or not you can use violence, all of these things. So my view is that morality is a way that humans have to choose sides when conflicts emerge, and that's its function, is a side-choosing function. Going back to the Baumeister case, as we discussed earlier, I now agree, or the psychology as a field agrees with me about the whole willpower thing. No one agrees with me about this view of morality. So just to say...
Really?
Yeah, to a first approximation, I would say my former student, Peter DeScioli, so he developed these ideas. In fact, he was more responsible for them than I was. And then maybe a couple of converts, but more or less, if you ask people what are the leading theories of morality, you're going to get John Haidt, and he has his 5 pillars of morality. And you're going to get, you're going to get people who talk about how morality is there to solve collective action problems. So you're going to get people like Oliver Curry, who says morality is all about cooperation. And then you're going to get some people who say it's all about harm. But no one thinks it's about choosing sides in conflicts. That's just basically me, Peter, maybe David, actually. I don't know if he's persuaded or not, but there's like 3 people who are persuaded. So that's okay.
Well, David, I know, is I believe he holds a favorable view of politics as an alliance game more than anything. So I wouldn't be surprised if he had similar, let's say, morally skeptical views as yourself. I wouldn't be surprised. Unfortunately, there's a ton to unpack in morality, and as much as I would love to talk about it, I think that for purposes of time constraints, we should call it there.
That's fine.
So before we wrap up, I do have one final question to ask you, and that is, if you were rewriting Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite today, if you were just about to finish, is there anything you would alter about it? Any ideas you would add that you didn't?
Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that. I have to say, and maybe this is sort of a little whatever, I was pretty happy with it. I feel like I was pretty pleased. I don't think there's any big strokes that I would change. I think that probably I would be even more clear. I try to be more clear about the opportunity cost model of effort that I have in the book, because I subsequently wrote a piece with a couple of colleagues of mine, and I think that piece is a little bit clearer and more thorough than I sort of was able to accomplish in the book. But I don't know, if I'm perfectly honest, I don't think I would change much. I feel like I said what I wanted to say, and I was able to say it in kind of a fun way. And I don't think there's too many cases in which the literature sort of caught up with me that I didn't, where I missed something about what was going to be true. I maybe would have been a bit more tentative back then. I was less skeptical about findings in the psychological literature. I mean, even then I was pretty skeptical, but now I'm even more so. So, for example, even some of the things that Danny Kahneman, arguably the greatest psychologist of his generation, he's sort of come out and said, yeah, I was too credulous about a lot of psychological findings. So I would probably add some caveats in there. But other than that, I don't think I would change much, for better or worse.
There's actually one thing I do want to circle back on, which we ended up covering something else. You talked about sexual overperception bias and that you don't think that that's the case. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So Marty Hazelton developed this idea, and she said, well, for male humans or male mammals, they don't want to miss an opportunity to mate, so they overestimate a woman's interest. And I did some work with Karen Paralleau. I don't know if you have show notes, but I can send you the links.
I do indeed, and this feels like a universe crossover kind of thing, like when different Marvel movies end up connecting. I can't believe you've worked with Karen Paralleau.
Yeah.
I actually reached out to her, and she mentioned that she had a lot of work on her plate, that she would consider speaking to me perhaps in spring. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, so Karen and I think have 1 or maybe 2 papers together. I can't remember. Wonderful scholar, underrated in my opinion.
Agreed.
And so we ran a study, which I commend to your readers, where we did a very kind of a fancy structure in which we tried to get at this question of whether people were just saying that they were overestimating, or they were really overestimating. And we think that we showed, I think, pretty clearly that it had to do with the way people were asked the question, that people are not really overestimating potential interests. I commend that to your reader. I will say that Bill von Hippel and Marty subsequently wrote a reply to that. So it's like everything else in academia. They say X, we're like Y, and they're like, but Z. And so, but yeah, this goes back to my prior point, which is that if I'm going to build an organism for mating, I'm going to build one that's pretty good at estimating how likely it is that this person is interested in me, because having that true belief is very valuable for making my subsequent decisions. That doesn't mean I don't necessarily, like, I might still continue a discussion or pursuing someone, even if that probability is very low. Right. So men and women probably have different thresholds, right? For a man, it's like this high, and for women, it's like this high. And so that's, I think, the most important piece, is that you could have a low estimate of the probability and still want to, pursue that option, particularly if you have nothing else better to do, right? So it always depends on the opportunity cost. My favorite idea. The key piece in decision making is the opportunity cost. What could I be doing other than this? What is the next best way I could be spending my time? And that's why having the true belief is always going to beat having the false belief.
So to clarify, your finding was that people's revealed belief, I guess, what they actually did was in line with a more accurate perception of sexual interest, but then what they said wasn't?
Yeah, I can... I'll make sure I have the links for you, and your
and I will definitely put that in the show notes.
Yeah, I can take a look.
And so, do you think that perhaps that could be a signaling kind of thing? Maybe they're saying that for some kind of social purpose? I
absolutely think it's a signaling thing. And this goes back to the prior thing. When you have stuff that looks weird, usually there's a persuasive social function, not a decision-making function. That's a very good heuristic to use. When you see weird stuff like beliefs in supernaturalism or the Easter Bunny, or crazy views about who was in the wrong in some moral conflict that just boggles your mind, look for the social piece about how do I signal that I'm a good group member? How do I signal that I'm a good person? Whatever. So it's that is crucial and something you got to keep your eye on when you're looking at what people say they believe.
So one thing to take away for the listener, if you find weird beliefs that don't seem to align with reality, look for the social function. How does this help them in terms of others' perception of them?
Totally.
Now, Robert Kurzban, thank you very much for joining me. I will, of course, have any socials you may have in the show notes. I will have a link to your book in the show notes as well. Is there anything else you'd like me to link? Oh, your Substack, of course. Anywhere else you want people to find you?
No, I mean, more people, the new stuff is on the Substack, and then with luck, we'll be able to circle back. I'll have a book coming out sometime early next year. It'll be called All the Feels, but we can talk about that next time. And for now, I just want to just reiterate, thank you so much for having me, and also for the kind words on the book, and I appreciate that very much.
Thank you very much for speaking to me. And yeah, we'll definitely have to circle back for All the Feels. Maybe we could circle back at some point as well for moral psychology. That's something interesting that we didn't really do justice to in this conversation. Thank you very much for speaking to me.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, I think you'll like my conversation with David Pinsoff here that I referenced in the episode, where we talk about evolutionary theory, self-deception, and various other topics. And also, I think you'll like this episode here, which the YouTube algorithm has chosen specifically for you. Thank you very much for watching.